Violation notice, Cynthia Bellamy snapped, her manicured hand shoving the paper hard against my chest. Cynthia wasn't just another neighbor drunk on authority. She was the president of our HOA board, smug enough to treat the pool house like her personal kingdom. Her eyes flicked toward the door I'd just watched my teenage daughter walk out of, the door Cynthia had followed her into minutes earlier. She smiled like nothing was wrong, like the whole neighborhood wasn't watching the way she blurred the line between enforcement and something far darker. You think you can hide behind sympathy, Mr. Keaton? Rules are rules. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. That notice says my daughter was loitering, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs building around us. But the security system you approved, I installed it, and it doesn't lie. Her smugness faltered, just enough for me to see the first crack. Before I go further, let me ask, where are you watching from right now? Because if you've ever dealt with someone who hides behind authority while targeting your family, you'll understand why this fight was different. And that's why you should subscribe right now, so you don't miss how this story turns when their lies collapse under the weight of truth. My name's Daniel Keaton, I said evenly, tucking the notice into my pocket. I design security systems for a living. 20 years of engineering work, city contracts, school districts, government sites. You put up the cameras around this pool, they still ping back to my server, and I've already seen the playback. Her jaw tightened, but she forced another smile, pretending she wasn't rattled. But this wasn't about a paper notice. This wasn't about pool rules or safety inspections. It was about the way Cynthia had trailed my daughter, 16 years old, through the locker room door, cornering her in a place no grown woman with power should ever be. It was about how my daughter's face had looked when she came back out, pale and stiff, clutching her towel like armor. That image burned into me, worse than any fine or violation letter. The HOA framed everything as rules, but for me, this was about something deeper. The community pool wasn't just chlorinated water and blue tiles. My wife had fought for that pool years ago, when the board wanted to close it after an accident. She said kids needed a place to feel safe, especially after what happened to our son. His drowning changed everything about how we lived here. That pool had become a promise I carried, that my daughter would never feel unsafe in the place her brother lost his life. Now, Cynthia was turning that promise into a weapon. She'd followed my girl into the very changing room my wife once defended, and then had the audacity to hand me a citation, as if we were the ones out of line. The notice might have been written in HOA language, loitering, disorderly conduct. But what I saw was a predator cloaking herself in policy, and I couldn't let that stand. The board had always been petty, letters about trash cans an inch too far from the curb, threats over my work van parked in the driveway, endless reminders about paint shades. But this crossed into something else entirely. This was no longer about property values. This was about my daughter's dignity, and about a woman who thought her title gave her the right to invade it. I stood there, still and unflinching, as the neighbors whispered around us. They saw Cynthia with her paper shield and her sharp voice. They saw me with nothing in my hands but the quiet certainty of truth. And even in that moment, I knew. I wouldn't just fight her. I'd dismantle the board's game from the inside, using the very systems they had trusted me to build. This wasn't about me versus a rule. It was me versus the corruption of power disguised as order. And I'd already chosen the battlefield. I left the pool deck with Cynthia's violation notice still folded in my pocket, the paper cutting into my skin like a reminder of her arrogance. Neighbors were still murmuring when I walked away, some shaking their heads, others avoiding my eyes. The moment I turned the corner into the clubhouse lobby, I felt the shift in atmosphere. It was quieter, heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. The framed photos of past board presidents lined the wall, Cynthia's polished smile right there among them. That picture had always looked smug to me, but after what happened at the pool, it felt sinister. I sat down at one of the worn leather chairs near the bulletin board. The smell of chlorine lingered on my shirt, and my daughter's pale face still haunted me. She hadn't said a word on the walk home, but I didn't need words. The silence was enough. That pool had been our family's fragile anchor after tragedy, and Cynthia had just poisoned it. I wasn't going to let her pretend this was some routine enforcement issue. A stack of HOA newsletters rested on the table beside me, their bold headers screaming about community pride and uniform standards. I flipped through one, pages rustling in my hand until I reached the section on surveillance and compliance. Monitored for safety, it read. Cynthia had approved that line herself. She'd pushed for the upgrades, claimed it was all about protecting children and property. I almost laughed at the irony, how she'd weaponized the very cameras I'd installed under her directive. The rage was there, simmering, but it wasn't the blind kind. My mind moved to strategy. I'd spent 2 decades designing systems to expose flaws, to catch what people wanted hidden. This wasn't any different. Cynthia believed she was untouchable because of her title, but the very structure she leaned on was her weakness. Those cameras didn't lie, and every clip still ran through my private. I'll back up. The board didn't know that. She didn't know that. But it meant I held the only objective truth about what really happened. The sound of footsteps broke my focus. A man I recognized, Paul Henderson, one of the board's treasurers, walked past carrying a binder thick with reports. He gave me a quick nod, then looked away, tension etched across his face. Paul had always been the quiet one in meetings, nodding along but never arguing. The way he avoided eye contact now told me something. Not everyone on that board was comfortable with Cynthia's methods. That realization added fuel to my resolve. The cracks were already there. All I had to do was widen them. I leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the community rules posted on the corkboard. Bold letters declared, all members must respect privacy of residence. The hypocrisy practically screamed at me. Cynthia's violation notice was already flimsy, but her decision to follow my daughter across that threshold, that was beyond any regulation. That was personal misconduct. And misconduct left trails. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the live feed of the pool cameras. I didn't need to replay the whole incident yet. I already knew what I'd seen. Instead, I checked the timestamps, the logs, the motion triggers, clean data, precise records. That was my leverage. Cynthia thought she could throw paper notices in my face and spin her story, but paper burned. Data didn't. As I sat there, another thought surfaced, one that made my chest tighten. My wife had fought for that pool so children could feel safe, and now our own daughter had been the target of someone who cloaked herself in authority. It wasn't just about clearing a violation or embarrassing a board president. This was about protecting my family's name, our home, and the memory of my son. Cynthia had crossed into sacred ground, and she didn't even know how badly she'd overplayed her hand. I stood up, slipping the phone back into my pocket. The clubhouse air felt stale, suffocating, like it carried every argument that had ever echoed inside. But as I walked toward the exit, clarity cut through the weight. The board wanted control through fear and paper. I held something stronger, truth preserved in code and circuitry, a system I'd designed myself. And once that truth came out, even Cynthia Bellamy's title wouldn't save her. This fight had only just begun. And I knew I couldn't wage it in silence. By the time I stepped out of the clubhouse, the late afternoon sun had shifted low enough to cast long shadows across the tennis courts. The sound of balls thudding against rackets echoed through the chain-link fence, a rhythm that almost drowned out the rush of my own pulse. I headed that way because I needed air, distance from the suffocating stillness Cynthia left behind. The courts were where neighbors usually pretended everything was fine, smiles painted on, gossip, tucked behind polite laughter. But today, tension rode the edges of the space. A few players shot me looks as I walked past, subtle, measuring. They'd seen the poolside confrontation, or at least heard whispers about it. The story was already spreading faster than any official notice. That was when I spotted him, Paul Henderson, the treasurer, the same man who had avoided my eyes in the clubhouse. He was leaning against the fence near the far court, binder under one arm, but his posture was restless. His hand kept flexing, thumb running over the edge of the folder, as if he wanted to open it, then thought better of it. His stance was stiff, shoulders drawn up high, like he carried the weight of more than just numbers. He glanced up, and our eyes met. For a second, Paul froze, his lips parting as though he might speak. Then he shifted, adjusting his glasses, turning slightly toward the court, as if the game unfolding in front of him was suddenly fascinating. But his body betrayed him. His foot tapped against the pavement, quick and uneven. His jaw clenched hard, then loosened, then clenched again. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in meetings where his silence lingered too long, where he sat caught between agreeing with Cynthia and not quite stomaching the decisions she pushed through. Paul wasn't built for confrontation, not like me, but his discomfort was its own kind of confession. I walked closer, letting the scrape of my shoes announce me. He didn't flinch, but he didn't look directly at me either. His grip tightened around the binder until his knuckles turned pale. "You know what she did was out of line," I said quietly. No accusation in my tone, just steady truth. His head dropped slightly, shoulders sagging for a fraction of a second, before he straightened again, like he'd caught himself showing too much. The struggle was right there in his body language. He wanted to acknowledge it, to admit the wrongness of what Cynthia had done, but fear chained him. Fear of being the one board member who cracked. Fear of standing against the person who had clawed her way to the top of the HOA and ruled it like her private empire. I didn't push harder, not yet. Strategy demanded patience. I just let the silence sit, heavy, long enough for him to feel it. His eyes flicked my way, only for an instant, but it was enough. Guilt lived in that glance. Knowledge, too. And knowledge was exactly what I needed. I stepped back, leaving him with the choice to speak when he was ready. My mind was already spinning, replaying the way his hand had hovered near the binder, the way his lips had parted before shutting tight again. That binder wasn't just financials, it was leverage. If Paul Henderson was already cracking under the weight of what he knew, then sooner or later, he'd have to decide whether silence was worth being complicit. The community deserved to see more than Cynthia's glossy newsletters and hollow speeches about safety. They needed to see what people like Paul were too afraid to admit outright, that the board wasn't united and the cracks in their armor were growing. Cynthia might hold the title of president, but her grip on loyalty was slipping. I stood near the fence, the chain link cool against my palm, and let the sounds of the court drown out the restless beat of my own thoughts. Paul shifted again, binder clutched close, his mouth opening once more before closing in defeat. His chest rose with a slow, heavy breath, like he'd just swallowed down words that might have burned him if he let them out. It wasn't enough yet, but it would be. I walked away, not triumphant, not defeated, just certain. Paul Henderson had just shown me he carried more than numbers. He carried secrets, and when the time came, he'd be the one to tip the balance, whether he intended to or not. I left the courts knowing Paul Henderson's silence was worth more than anything he might have said out loud. His body language had screamed conflict, and that told me enough. The board wasn't a monolith, no matter how Cynthia Bellamy wanted to portray it, but hesitation alone wouldn't protect my daughter, and it wouldn't stop Cynthia's next move. I didn't have to wait long to see just how far she was willing to escalate. By evening, a letter slid under my front door. The heavy HOA letterhead announced itself before I even picked it up, the envelope thick, its contents folded with precision. I opened it at the kitchen counter, my daughter sitting silently at the table, her eyes still shadowed from earlier. The letter was sharper than the notice Cynthia had shoved at me. It wasn't just about loitering. This one accused us of creating a hostile environment at the pool, warning of suspension of community privileges if harassment of board members continued. It was classic Cynthia. Turn her own misconduct into my alleged crime, twist the narrative until the victim looked like the aggressor. She thought paper threats and official stamps would scare me into silence. Instead, it had the opposite effect. I walked outside, letter still in hand, and stood in my driveway. The cul-de-sac stretched quiet in the dusk, porch lights blinking on one by one. My neighbor across the street, an older veteran named Mr. Calhoun, gave me a nod as he watered his lawn. I lifted the letter slightly, a wordless gesture, and his face hardened like he already knew the pattern Cynthia was running. The driveway wasn't just concrete under my feet. It was the place where I had taught my daughter to ride her bike, the place where my son used to set up his basketball hoop before everything changed. To stand here now, accused of harassment while trying to protect my family, twisted the air tight in my chest. Cynthia wasn't just escalating. She was trying to isolate us, to paint me as unstable so no one would question her. But I had more than memories and outrage. I had records. My server had already logged the motion alerts from the pool cameras, the digital fingerprints of Cynthia's intrusion. She could spin paper all she wanted, but those logs were immune to her manipulations. My expertise meant I didn't need to break into files or dig through garages. I had a clean, verifiable chain of truth, and if she wanted to escalate this into a battle of narratives, I'd meet her escalation with evidence she couldn't erase. I heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Diane Mallory, the HOA secretary, heading down the sidewalk. She was mid-40s, sharp in her dress, but always carrying a nervous energy. Tonight, her steps slowed when she saw me with the letter in hand. Her eyes darted to it, then to my face. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she only gave me a strained smile and hurried past. Still, that flicker mattered. It confirmed what Paul's hesitation had hinted at. Not everyone was comfortable backing Cynthia's tactics. Some of them were barely holding their silence together. That was another fracture I could use later. I went back inside, sat down at my desk, and scanned the letter into my system. The whir of the scanner was steady, mechanical, almost comforting against the storm in my head. I opened the logs from the cameras again, cross-checking timestamps, flagging the motion triggers. Every line of code, every clip, was another nail in the coffin of Cynthia's lies. But what struck me most was the language in her letter, creating a hostile environment. She was trying to flip the script, to make it seem like I was the danger. That was more than arrogance. It was a gamble. Because once the community started questioning who was truly hostile, the evidence would speak louder than her position ever could. As night settled in, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant barbecue. The porch light glowed against the wooden bench my father built years ago, the one I'd kept as a reminder of where I came from. That bench wasn't just furniture, it was legacy, the symbol of standing firm no matter how many people tried to push you down. Cynthia Bellamy wanted a battle of paper. I was ready for a battle of truth. And standing there on my porch, with the weight of her letter in my hand and the glow of that bench at my side, I knew exactly how I was going to fight back. I stayed on the porch long after the street grew quiet, Cynthia's letter heavy in my hand. Porch lights blinked out one by one, until only a few dim windows glowed in the cul-de-sac. That old bench beneath me creaked when I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, but it held steady, same as it always had. It was a reminder that some things were built to withstand pressure, even when everything else felt like it was cracking. The next morning, I took my fight to neutral ground, the public library 2 miles outside the neighborhood. If Cynthia thought she controlled the narrative within our gates, I wasn't about to give her home turf advantage. The library was quiet, sterile, and humming with the sound of computer fans. I logged into my secure server from a corner desk, the violation letter resting on the table beside me, like a challenge waiting to be answered. The footage was clean. Camera 3, angled at the pool house entrance, showed my daughter heading inside with her towel clutched tight. 22 seconds later, Cynthia appeared in frame, stepping through the same door, her face set in that trademark scowl of authority. No hesitation, no official purpose in hand, just her, following where no board member had any business going. When the door closed behind her, the motion log marked the event, precise down to the millisecond. I replayed it twice, then once more, every second cutting deeper. She thought this was power. She thought no one would ever call her out. But I wasn't just any homeowner. I'd designed these systems to be tamper-proof, admissible if ever challenged. Every feed carried embedded watermarks, every log cross-referenced with redundant backups. Cynthia could write 100 notices, but she couldn't erase digital truth coded by my own hand. As I flagged the file and created an encrypted copy, I thought about her language. Hostile environment. She wanted to flip the story, make me the aggressor. But this clip didn't just refute her. It exposed her as the one creating fear where safety was promised. And once this surfaced, it wouldn't just be me she'd have to answer to. Parents, neighbors, even insurance carriers. Every one of them would see the liability she represented. The hum of the library faded as I sat back, eyes locked on the frozen frame of Cynthia entering that door. My wife's voice echoed in my memory from years ago when she fought to keep the pool open. Kids deserve a safe place. That had been her mantra after our son's accident, the fuel behind her relentless advocacy. And now, the very woman who'd benefited from my wife's fight was the one desecrating it. I exported the clip, stored it on a flash drive, and labeled it simply, Pool House, HOA Source Incident 1. Evidence didn't need flourish. It just needed to be undeniable. On my way out, I passed a cluster of neighbors flipping through community flyers pinned near the library entrance. One of them noticed me, eyes darting down to the folder under my arm, then back up again. Whispers followed me out the door. Word was spreading, and not just about the notice Cynthia had flaunted. The story was shifting. The parking lot was half empty, sunlight bouncing off the hoods of cars. I slid into my truck, gripped the steering wheel, and let the weight of the discovery settle in. This wasn't just about confronting Cynthia anymore. This was about building a case, piece by piece, until the board's foundation cracked under its own hypocrisy. I drove back through the gates of the neighborhood, the flash drive, burning like a live coal in my pocket. Cynthia had escalated with threats on paper. I had escalated with proof carved into silicon and time stamps. And while she paraded authority at meetings, I would let the footage speak in a language she couldn't spin. The war she'd started wasn't going to be fought on her terms. It would be fought in truth, in evidence, and in the eyes of the very community she pretended to protect. As I pulled into my driveway, the sight of that bench came into view again, solid, enduring. I knew then that what I carried wasn't just data, it was legacy. It was the continuation of the promise my family had bled for, and I was ready to use it. The bench stood steady in my yard as I killed the truck's engine, but inside me, nothing felt steady anymore. The flash drive in my pocket was evidence, yes, but it was also weight, a reminder that Cynthia Bellamy's reach wouldn't stop at paper letters. She'd escalate again, and if I wasn't ready, she'd twist my silence into her weapon. That night, the neighborhood clubhouse was alive with motion. A yoga class had just let out, neighbors milling around in small clusters, water bottles in hand, mats slung over shoulders. I went there not for exercise, but because Cynthia thrived on spectacle. And if she planned to push the next stage of her campaign, she'd do it where the most eyes were watching. I wasn't wrong. Her voice carried across the lobby before I even stepped inside. "We must maintain order," Cynthia declared, standing near the reception desk with a stack of notices in hand. "We can't allow intimidation of board members, no matter who it comes from." Her tone was sharp, rehearsed, as if she was already addressing a courtroom. A few neighbors nodded, others looked away. Nobody dared confront her directly. I moved to the far side of the room, leaning against the vending machine, watching. She thrived under attention, but what struck me was the silence around her. People listened, but their body language was cautious, closed off. They weren't inspired, they were wary, and wariness meant fertile ground for truth, if it was sown at the right time. I pulled out my phone, opened the secured feed, and cued the clip of her trailing my daughter into the pool house. Not to play it yet, that moment had to be precise, but to feel its weight. Knowing I had it was like gripping a concealed blade in a fight where the other side only had paper shields. Then I noticed him again. Paul Henderson stood near the entrance to the multi-purpose room, binder in his arms, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His tie was loosened, his eyes darting between Cynthia and the neighbors, his shoulders stiff with the same unease I'd seen at the tennis courts. Every part of his body screamed conflict, like he wanted to step forward but kept chaining himself back. Cynthia spotted me across the room, her lips curled into that smirk she reserved for moments she thought she had the upper hand. "Mr. Keaton," she called out loudly, drawing every eye in the room toward me. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why your family believes they're exempt from rules designed for everyone's safety." The room went silent. My daughter's face flashed in my mind, pale and tight after Cynthia cornered her in that locker room. My wife's voice echoed, "Kids deserve a safe place." I straightened, pushed away from the vending machine, and stepped into the circle of attention Cynthia had crafted. "Safety?" I said, steady but cold. "Is that what you call following a 16-year-old girl into a changing room?" Gasps rippled across the lobby. Cynthia's smile faltered, then tightened into something brittle. She raised the paper notice in her hand like a shield. "Baseless accusation," she snapped. "My duties require inspections." But her eyes betrayed her. Just for a fraction of a second, they flickered toward Paul, as if she was silently demanding backup. Paul's fingers flexed against the binder, his jaw clenched, but he didn't step forward. He stayed rooted, conflict etched across his whole frame. That silence, that refusal, said more than words ever could. I didn't push further, not yet. This wasn't the moment to unsheathe the footage, but the room had shifted. Neighbors looked at her differently now, whispers buzzing at the edges. Cynthia had tried to frame me as hostile, but her arrogance had cracked under public pressure, and cracks, once visible, only spread wider. When the crowd thinned, I left without another word, the night air sharp against my face. The clip remained secure on the drive, my unseen blade, but tonight had given me something just as valuable. The community had glimpsed her for what she was. As I walked home under the glow of porch lights, the bench came back into view, glowing faintly in the spill of my own lamp. It reminded me of endurance, of promises carried forward. Cynthia had chosen escalation. I had chosen truth. And soon, truth would corner her in a place no notice could defend. The glow of the porch light and the solid weight of the bench steadied me that night. But I knew things had shifted inside the clubhouse. Cynthia Bellamy's smile had cracked in front of her audience, and Paul Henderson's silence had roared louder than any defense he might have offered. Still, silence wasn't enough. If I wanted to dismantle Cynthia's paper-thin empire, I needed more than proof. I needed someone from the inside to admit what they already knew. The chance came sooner than I expected. The following afternoon, I headed to the community park at the edge of the neighborhood, a stretch of open grass dotted with picnic tables and a half-broken swing set. It was where families gathered for birthday parties, where teenagers hung out on weekends, and where board members rarely ventured. I liked it for that reason. It was neutral ground. I spotted Paul there, sitting alone on one of the benches under a jacaranda tree, binder resting on his lap, papers half spilling out. His tie was gone, sleeves rolled up, and he looked less like a treasurer and more like a man who'd been losing sleep. He didn't notice me until I was close enough that the gravel crunched under my boots. When his eyes lifted, his shoulders stiffened. He pressed the binder shut with one hand, but not fast enough to hide the nervous shuffle. I sat across from him at the picnic table, not saying a word at first. His body language told me enough. The tight grip, the restless tapping foot, the way he kept glancing toward the parking lot like he wanted an escape. Finally, he exhaled, long and shaky. "You weren't wrong last night," he muttered, almost too quiet to hear. His gaze stayed on the grain of the wood, but his voice carried weight. She shouldn't have gone in there. It was the closest thing to an admission I'd gotten, and it landed heavy. I leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Then why protect her?" I asked. Paul rubbed his temple, his whole frame sagging like the truth was crushing him. "Because she threatens us. Every single one of us. She's got a way of making it seem like resistance equals exile. People fall in line because they don't want the target on their backs." He paused, his jaw working as though the words themselves hurt. "But this is different. Following your daughter, that's a line none of us should have let her cross." His hand moved to the binder again, fingertips brushing the edge. Then, in one quick motion, he slid a folded paper across the table toward me. His eyes flicked up, desperate, conflicted. "I shouldn't be giving you this, but you need to see what she wrote into the minutes." I unfolded it slowly. The document was a draft of last week's board meeting notes, unsigned but clear. One section was highlighted in yellow. "President Bellamy reserves authority to conduct on-site compliance checks of common facilities, including restrooms and locker areas." My stomach tightened. There it was, her attempt to cloak her misconduct in official language. She'd tried to slip it into the record like it was a routine authority, legitimizing the very act she'd been caught doing. Paul's voice broke the silence. "It wasn't approved. We didn't vote on it. But she pressured the secretary to draft it anyway, said it was just keeping records consistent." His shoulders hunched, his fingers digging into the wood of the table. I didn't speak up. I should have, but I couldn't. His guilt was written in every twitch, every shallow breath. He wasn't just conflicted, he was complicit, and it was eating him alive. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it into my pocket alongside the flash drive. Between the footage and this draft, Cynthia's entire defense strategy was collapsing. She had crossed the line in practice, then tried to rewrite the rules, to protect herself afterward. And now, thanks to Paul, I had the proof of both. "You've done enough," I said quietly, though my voice carried an edge. "What matters now is what happens next." Paul nodded weakly, his eyes still cast down, but his silence no longer felt like refusal. It felt like surrender. As I walked away from the park, the folded draft heavy in my pocket, I knew the victory strategy had just shifted gears. Evidence was one thing, but an insider's confession, paired with hard data, was something even Cynthia Bellamy couldn't paper over. The folded draft from Paul weighed heavier in my pocket than the flash drive ever had. Together, they weren't just evidence. They were a blueprint of Cynthia Bellamy's corruption, proof that she twisted rules to shield her own violations. By the time I left the park, my mind was already sharpening into a plan. This wasn't about surviving her harassment anymore. It was about dismantling the fortress she thought she'd built. The next morning, I drove to my office on the edge of town. The industrial park was quiet, low brick buildings and security cameras lining every corner. My company wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. For 2 decades, clients had come here when they needed systems that couldn't be bent, manipulated, or erased. It was fitting that this was the place where I'd build the counterattack. I unlocked the front door, the faint hum of servers greeting me as I stepped inside. Rows of monitors lit up when I powered the main console, their glow filling the room like the start of a vigil. I laid out the pieces of the puzzle on the desk: Cynthia's violation notice, the official letter accusing me of harassment, the flash drive with the footage, and Paul's leaked draft. Each one represented a layer of her arrogance, and each one could be dismantled in sequence. First came organization. I uploaded the footage into a secure folder, embedding the original watermarked metadata that tied it back to the day of the incident. Then, I scanned Paul's draft and cross-referenced it against official board records, highlighting the absence of any vote or approval. The data aligned perfectly. Cynthia had tried to rewrite history, but the trail of her deception was obvious. Next came redundancy. I mirrored everything to 3 encrypted drives, each stashed in a separate location. One in my office safe, one prepared for my attorney, and one stored off-site through a secure cloud. If Cynthia thought she could corner me with threats of fines or suspension, she'd find out the truth was bulletproof. But this wasn't only about hoarding evidence. My profession taught me that systems weren't toppled by one flaw alone. They crumbled when pressure hit multiple points at once. Cynthia had paper, signatures, and the illusion of authority. I had hard data, an insider's admission, and the expertise to turn both into weapons she couldn't counter. As I typed, the plan formed into 3 stages: presentation, exposure, escalation. First, present the evidence to the right eyes, the ones who couldn't ignore what they saw. Second, expose the draft for what it was, an illegal attempt to expand authority without a vote. And third, escalate the risk until Cynthia's own allies realized she was liability, not leadership. Hours passed unnoticed as I built timelines, clipped footage into digestible segments, and annotated Paul's notes. The hum of the servers became background music to my focus, each keystroke another nail in Cynthia's coffin. My fingers shook not from fear, but from clarity. This was what I was built for, finding the flaw in a system, exposing it, and letting its own weight do the destruction. By the time the sun dipped low enough to streak orange light across my office blinds, I had everything packaged, a clean presentation of truth that no board meeting rhetoric could twist. My wife's voice echoed again in my memory. Kids deserve a safe place. That's what this plan was. Not vengeance, not personal ego. It was the preservation of a promise. I shut down the monitors, the room plunging back into dim silence, and locked the evidence away. When I stepped outside, the evening air was cooler, sharp with the scent of rain about to fall. For the first time in days, my chest loosened. Not because the fight was over, it was far from it, but because the path forward was clear. Cynthia Bellamy had chosen escalation. I had chosen strategy. And strategy always won when the system itself was turned against those who abused it. The storm clouds that had threatened rain the night before broke open the following afternoon. Sheets of water hammered against the streets, wind driving it sideways so hard the trees bowed under its force. Most people stayed inside, garages sealed tight, driveways empty. But I wasn't most people. I had preparation to finish, and the storm gave me cover. I drove through the downpour to the neighborhood community center, a squat brick building that doubled as storage for HOA archives and community equipment. Cynthia favored it as a backdrop for her speeches about shared responsibility. But today, it was deserted. Perfect. The storm drowned out everything, even the sound of my boots on the slick pavement as I stepped inside. The center smelled of damp wood and cleaning supplies, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I set up at one of the long folding tables, pulling out the evidence kit I'd assembled the night before. Laptop, drives, scanned documents, and a small projector I kept for client presentations. If Cynthia wanted the next board meeting to be theater, I was making sure I controlled the script. I began with the footage. The clip of Cynthia trailing my daughter into the pool house played clean and sharp against the blank wall, the timestamp bright in the corner, 22 seconds. That was all it took to redefine her narrative. I trimmed it, highlighted the trigger logs, and embedded a frame-by-frame breakdown. No one could claim it was doctored. The embedded metadata tied it to the original server, and I'd prepared affidavits ready to show chain of custody. Next, I overlaid Paul Henderson's draft. The highlighted section glowed under the projector beam, Cynthia attempting to slip her authority into official minutes without a vote. Paired with the footage, it was damning. She couldn't argue she'd simply made a mistake when the draft showed she tried to cover her tracks retroactively. Intent was the nail, and her own secretary's notes had hammered it in. Thunder rolled outside, rattling the windows, as if punctuating the moment. I muted the storm in my head and kept working. I built the flow of the presentation so it mirrored Cynthia's own escalation. First, the paper violation she shoved at me, then the official harassment letter, then the footage, finally the draft. Each step built pressure, each step exposing how her power was nothing but intimidation stacked on lies. But the heart of the plan wasn't the evidence itself. It was timing. The upcoming board meeting would draw the highest attendance of the year. Budget allocations, landscaping contracts, issues everyone in the neighborhood cared about. Cynthia would walk in confident, papers in hand, expecting to set the narrative. That was when I'd let the truth speak louder than her words ever could. I practiced the sequence, fingers steady on the projector remote, pacing the flow of each clip and slide. I wasn't rehearsing speeches, words could be twisted. I was rehearsing silence, letting the evidence speak. The image of her stepping into that changing room, paired with the draft authorizing herself to do it, would speak louder than anything I could say. As I shut down the projector and packed the drives, the storm outside began to ease, the rain falling softer now, a steady patter instead of a roar. Through the window, I could see neighbors venturing out again, umbrellas popping open, children splashing in puddles. Life moved forward, even in the shadow of corruption. That was the point. This wasn't just about protecting my family. It was about preserving a community where children didn't have to look over their shoulders in a place meant to be safe. I gathered everything into the case, double-checking every piece. The flash drive with footage, the scanned draft from Paul, my server logs, redundant backups. Redundancy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Cynthia's weapon was paper. Mine was truth encoded so deeply she couldn't shred it, couldn't rewrite it, couldn't escape it. When I stepped back into the storm-thinned air, the sky was split between gray clouds and streaks of gold light breaking through. It felt like a sign, not victory yet, but inevitability. Cynthia Bellamy had written the script for too long. At the next meeting, she'd be forced to read a new one, the streaks of gold breaking through the storm. Clouds faded into dusk as I drove back through the neighborhood gates, the case of evidence strapped into the passenger seat like a co-pilot. The upcoming board meeting wasn't just another date on the calendar anymore. It was the battleground where Cynthia Bellamy's empire would fracture. Every detail had to be in place, every angle covered. 2 nights before the meeting, I walked to the small church at the far end of the neighborhood. It wasn't tied to the HOA, which made it one of the few places she didn't control. The building was quiet, its brick walls damp from the storm, the air inside cool and faintly scented with candle wax. Folding chairs were stacked against the wall, hymnals resting neatly on the pews. I'd chosen it deliberately as the staging ground for my final preparations. I set my laptop on a pew and booted it up, the projector humming softly as I tested the presentation against the pale wall of the sanctuary. The footage flickered into life, Cynthia following my daughter into the pool house. The silence of the church gave the clip a gravity I hadn't felt before. Watching it here, in a space meant for reflection and trust, underscored exactly how far she'd strayed from both. I let the clip loop once, then advanced to the draft Paul Henderson had given me. The yellow highlight glared under the projector light, her unauthorized claim of authority staring back like a confession. I imagined the boardroom packed with neighbors, Cynthia standing tall at the head of the table. I pictured the hush when these images played for all to see. That moment would be the turning point. But this wasn't only about impact, it was about precision. I cross-checked every timestamp, verified metadata, and ensured every file was duplicated in case she tried to dismiss it as fabrication. Redundancy was my shield. Expertise was my sword. Together, they'd slice through every accusation she tried to throw. The church door creaked behind me, and I turned to see Paul step in. His shoulders were slumped, his binder gone this time, just his own nervous frame framed by the doorway. He didn't speak at first. He just watched the frozen frame of Cynthia on the wall, lips pressed thin, fingers twitching at his sides. "She doesn't know I gave you that draft," he said finally, voice low but steady. "She'll know soon enough," I replied. His eyes closed for a moment, and he nodded like he was bracing for impact. The guilt still weighed heavy on him, but the fact that he'd come here, away from Cynthia's shadow, told me his conflict had shifted into decision. He wouldn't stand with her when this broke. I shut the projector down and packed the equipment, locking everything into the case again. Paul lingered near the door, shifting his weight as though he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. In the end, silence was enough. His presence alone meant Cynthia's armor was crumbling from the inside. On my way out, I touched the wooden railing by the altar, the smooth grain cool under my palm. It reminded me of the bench at home, legacy made tangible, promises carved into wood. My family's dignity wasn't going to be sacrificed on the altar of her authority. Not now. Not ever. The night air was cool as I walked back, the church bell faint in the distance. Every step home felt heavier with anticipation, but also lighter with clarity. Cynthia thought she was walking into another routine meeting, another chance to flaunt her control. She had no idea the ground was about to give way beneath her feet. Back at the house, I placed the evidence case on the bench, right where the porch light hit it. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the glow reflect off its metal edges. This was more than preparation. It was a promise that the truth would not be buried. The stage was set. The evidence was ready. And in just 2 days, the community would finally see Cynthia Bellamy without her mask. The night of the board meeting, the clubhouse was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs lined the back wall, every seat filled, and neighbors leaned against the door frames, arms crossed, eyes sharp with curiosity. The air was thick with the scent of coffee from the refreshment table, and the undercurrent of tension no one could ignore. Cynthia Bellamy stood at the head of the long oak table, her stack of notices fanned out in front of her like playing cards. She smiled, smug and polished, but I saw the tightness around her eyes. She knew the room was watching more carefully than usual. I took my seat near the middle row, the case of evidence at my feet. My daughter sat at home, but I felt her presence here, every ounce of fear and humiliation she'd carried fueling my resolve. The bench at home had been a reminder of endurance. Tonight would be the test. Cynthia banged the gavel. "We'll begin," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "First order of business, disciplinary action for residents who've shown hostility toward board members." Her gaze locked on me, lingering a beat too long. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew who she meant. That was her mistake. She wanted a spectacle, but she didn't understand what happened when you gave the crowd front row seats to the truth. I stood, slow and deliberate, lifting the evidence case onto the table with a sharp thud that cut through the noise. "Before you accuse me any further," I said, voice steady but loud enough to carry, "the community deserves to see what really happened." Cynthia's smile wavered. "You're out of order." But I was already opening the case, pulling out the projector. The room hushed as I connected it to the laptop. The blank wall behind the board flickered, then filled with grainy but undeniable footage. Gasps erupted as the clip played, my daughter stepping into the pool house, Cynthia following her inside 22 seconds later. The timestamp glowed in the corner, unshakable proof. The crowd shifted forward, people whispering, some covering their mouths. One neighbor muttered loud enough to carry, "She followed a child?" Cynthia's voice cracked as she scrambled for ground. "That's misrepresented. It was an inspection." I clicked to the next slide. Paul Henderson's draft appeared on the wall, the highlighted section blinding under the light. President Bellamy reserves authority to conduct on-site compliance checks of common facilities, including restrooms and locker areas. The room erupted. Murmurs turned into shouts. A woman from the back stood up, pointing at Cynthia. "You tried to give yourself the right to follow kids into locker rooms?" Paul shifted in his chair, binder closed tightly in front of him, his silence more damning than any words. Everyone saw it, saw that even her own board wasn't defending her now. Cynthia slammed her palm against the table. "Enough! This is slander. This is manipulation of—" I cut her off with one final click. The motion logs filled the screen, timestamps aligning perfectly with the footage. "I built these systems," I said, my voice cutting through the uproar. "These logs are tamper-proof, watermarked, backed up across 3 independent servers. This isn't my word against hers. This is truth." The crowd turned, their focus shifting entirely away from her polished notices and toward the glowing evidence. Anger thickened in the air, voices overlapping. Predator. Liability. She can't stay president? Cynthia's face paled, her composure unraveling. She looked to her fellow board members for rescue, but Diane Mallory stared down at her folded hands, and Paul kept his eyes fixed firmly on the table. She was alone, the walls of power she'd built crumbling in front of everyone. The gavel slipped from her hand and clattered against the table. That sound sealed it. The authority she'd wielded like a weapon had been stripped by her own actions. I shut the projector down, the wall returning to blank silence. But the damage was done. The crowd wasn't looking at me anymore. They were staring at Cynthia Bellamy, president of the HOA, not as a leader, but as a predator cloaked in rules. And in that silence, heavy and undeniable, the community made its decision without needing a single vote. The silence after the gavel hit the table stretched long, heavy, suffocating. Cynthia Bellamy stood frozen at the head of the board, her notices fanned out like a broken deck of cards no one wanted to play anymore. Around her, the crowd of neighbors simmered, their whispers sharp with anger, disbelief, and something more, relief. Relief that someone had finally cracked the facade she'd ruled behind. I stayed standing, hands resting on the projector case, the echoes of the footage still alive in everyone's minds. I didn't need to say more. The truth had already done the work. The room itself had shifted. People weren't looking to Cynthia for leadership anymore. They were looking at one another, realizing they had the power to push back. One man from the back row broke the silence. "That's not leadership. That's abuse." Others nodded, voices rising. "She followed a kid. She lied to us. We trusted her." Paul Henderson finally raised his head. His face was pale, but his voice, though quiet, carried. "The draft she tried to insert into the record? It wasn't approved. She acted alone. I should have spoken up sooner." The tremor in his voice made it clear he wasn't proud, but his confession sealed her fate. No one could argue anymore that Cynthia's misconduct was misunderstanding or exaggeration. Cynthia opened her mouth, but no sound came. She shuffled her papers, desperate, but even she seemed to realize they meant nothing now. The notices she'd weaponized for years looked flimsy, useless, a shield no one respected. Her eyes darted to the side door, like she was considering flight, but she stayed rooted in place, trapped by the weight of every stare. The HOA bylaws required procedure for removal, but the community didn't need paperwork to strip her of legitimacy. In that moment, she was already finished. The board members avoided her gaze, refusing to lend support. Neighbors who once cowered under her notices stood taller now, their voices louder, steadier. It was the kind of shift you could feel in your bones, when fear gave way to fury. I closed the projector case and lifted it from the table. The weight didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like closure, not just for me, but for my daughter, who deserved to know her father hadn't let her humiliation be swept away. For my wife, who had fought for the pool to remain a safe haven. For my son's memory, tied to that place, reminding me that promises meant something even when the cost was steep. I walked out of the clubhouse into the night, the sound of raised voices following me. The crowd wasn't dispersing. They were organizing, talking over one another about what came next, about bylaws, about votes, about how they'd never allow someone like Cynthia to hold power again. The seeds had been planted, and they were already taking root. At home, the porch light spilled warm over the bench my father built. I sat down, the wood familiar under me, solid as always. My daughter came out quietly, sitting beside me. She didn't speak, just leaned her head against my shoulder. That was enough. The fight had been worth it for this alone, for her to feel safe again in her own neighborhood. The bench wasn't just wood and nails, it was legacy. It was a reminder that no matter how strong someone pretended to be behind titles and letters, truth always outlasted tyranny. Cynthia Bellamy had written her own downfall the moment she followed my daughter into that changing room. All I did was make sure the community saw it, and now the fight was bigger than me. Neighbors who'd once been silent had found their voices. Families who thought the HOA was untouchable now saw its flaws. Change was coming, not because I demanded it, but because the truth had forced it. That was victory. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.